My name is Paul Wolliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products, and this is the installation instruction video for the generators that use the Ducar 98cc engine. For the purpose of this video, I will be using an Onan 2500. Note right off that the Onan 2500 uses or has the fuel selector valve on the side of the generator, where some of the other generators that use the same engine, the fuel selector valve is on the front of it. So please be aware of those differences. Right out of the gate, this is not a super simple kit to install because of the amount of space inside the generator. There are some areas that are a little bit tricky. Something that I'd like to cover really quickly is if you're watching this video on YouTube instead of on my website and you want to leave a comment on the video, go ahead and leave a comment, but please do not leave any comments that require a reply because I do not monitor the comments and so forth, and it may be months before I happen to see a comment. So if you have a question or something like that, please follow the link in the description section right below the video, and it's got a link to my website. If you contact me through my website, you'll get an answer immediately because I do monitor my emails. Okay, first step for the install is to remove this little rubber plug on the fuel selector valve that covers the screw holding the knob on. Then, using a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, go ahead and remove the knob for the fuel selector valve. Then, using a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, remove the 4 small screws that hold this cover in place. Now these screws are a small countersunk screw, and they are the only 4 screws that you're going to be removing that look like this. So make sure and set them separate. Go ahead and pull the recoil rope and then ease this panel out just a little bit. And with a pair of locking pliers or forceps, lock the recoil rope so it doesn't keep pulling back on you. Now you come around to the front of the generator. There are 4 more Phillips head screws, and they hold the display panel on. Go ahead and remove all 4 of those screws. And these screws are different from the ones that held the recoil start cover in place. And the display panel can just hang loose like that for right now. Now we're going to remove this side cover from the generator. So you turn this knob to the unlock position, and then there are several little buttons that just snap into place. And you lift the cover off. So now with this cover removed, what we're going to do is take another pair of forceps, and we're going to crimp the fuel line that goes from the tank to the fuel selector valve. And that would be this one right here. If you can see it clearly. This fuel line. Okay, now that we've got the clamp on the fuel hose coming out of the fuel tank going over to the fuel selector valve, we can remove that hose from the fuel selector valve without the fear of gasoline running all over the place on us. What we're going to do is use a pair of needle nose pliers, and we're going to squeeze in on the two tabs on the Corbin clamp that goes into the front of this fuel selector valve here. So we'll squeeze in the two tabs and slide the Corbin clamp out of the way, and then we will slide the hose off of the fuel selector valve, and that allows us to get this panel out just a little bit more. Let me take a minute to show you how a Corbin clamp works exactly. Okay, this is a Corbin clamp. It has two little ears on it, and if you take a pair of pliers and you squeeze, you'll notice that the clamp itself opens up, and when you release, you notice the clamp itself gets tighter. So that's where you reach in and you squeeze those two tabs and then wiggle this clamp back away from the fuel selector valve, and then you'll slide the hose off of the fuel selector valve. I'm going to put this Corbin clamp back on the hose so that I don't lose it. Now what we're going to do is, if you'll look at the bottom of the fuel selector valve, there's a little electric micro switch, and what that does is it kills the spark. So it shuts the engine off when you rotate the fuel knob to the off position. It not only shuts off the fuel, but shuts off the spark. What we want to do is have it so that you can shut the fuel off, but it will still have spark. This is going to do two things. Number one, if you're going to be storing the generator and you're running off of the stock tank, you can shut the fuel off and leave the generator running until it uses up the fuel in the float bowl, so you don't have so much fuel oxidizing and going bad while the generator's stored. Or if you're using it on my remote tank, then you're already going to have the fuel selector valve in the off position. That way it doesn't suck air out of the remote tank. But you would disconnect the quick disconnect hose from my remote tank and run it until the fuel in the carburetor is used up. So now let's go and mount our remote mounted ignition switch. So now we're going to go ahead and mount our remote mounted ignition switch. So the first thing we're going to do is disconnect these two wires from this switch. We're going to leave the switch in place because it's not going to do any harm. It's just not going to be functional. As we're working on this, we want to be very careful not to pull so hard on this that we pull the choke cable completely out, because that choke cable is just barely stuck in there, and it would be easy for us to pull too hard and get it ripped out. If so, then it's a hassle to put it back in. Okay, to disconnect these two wires, we're simply going to cut the wires right where they go into this little micro switch. And now you can see the two wires that used to go into the micro switch. What we're going to do, I do not want to mount the switch on this side of the generator, because then you'd have a switch sticking out, and I want it to be nice and smooth on the sides. What we're going to do is right here on the display, you'll see where there's the eco mode switch and then the parallel ports. If you look right between the eco mode and the parallel ports, where my thumbnail is where we're going to mount our new little switch. If you look at this area here, you'll notice that this surface is at an angle, so you don't want to mount this switch up very high. Try to drill your hole to where it is actually at or below the words eco mode. And we'll go ahead and drill that hole. Okay, we're going to drill the hole out to a 3/16 of an inch, which is just slightly smaller than the switch we're going to put into it. If we don't accidentally wallow the hole with the drill bit, we'll use a repairman's reamer to cut it out just a little bit larger. So I'm going to go right where the word economy mode, about halfway between the switch and the parallel port, and just down from the word economy mode, just slightly, is where I'm going to drill my hole. Okay, now that I've got the hole drilled, I'm going to do a test fit with my switch. Okay, this is the switch that you're going to be installing. So now go ahead and remove the nuts and the friction washer from this switch and set them off to the side and do a test fit to see if that switch will fit into the hole that you just drilled. Okay, it's a little bit tight, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a repairman's reamer to open up the hole just a little bit. Unfortunately, it's just slightly larger than a 3/16, but not quite the next size up. Okay, that's a nice tight fit there. Okay, I'm going to take a burring tool and just scrape the burrs off the back of the panel. And now what we'll do is we'll install the switch and then put the lock nut onto the front of it. Now, since we don't know whether we're putting the switch in right side up or upside down, what you'll do is you'll find out which way the switch toggles, and right here is up and down, and you'll just put it in, and hopefully up is on and down is off. If you get it upside down, you simply loosen up the lock nut, spin the switch right side up, and then you'll have up will be on and down will be off. So we're going to go ahead and install the switch in the hole that we drilled. I'm going to take one of the nuts easier said than done. And thread it down. Okay. I wanted to take just a couple seconds to show you why I said don't aggravate this too much, because you don't want the choke cable to come out. This is the choke cable right here. And as you can see, right now it's starting to come up out of that groove. Right there is the groove where the choke cable is supposed to ride in. Make sure that the choke cable itself gets back in that groove. Here's a better angle on it. You can see that when you go to put this panel back into place. So right now it's at the verge of popping out, and trust me, you don't want it to pop out, because then you got to take a screwdriver and lift up on this steel plate right here, just ever so slightly, to put that cable back into the spot where it's supposed to go. And you can see there where it's just clinging on for dear life. And hopefully I won't have to go through that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take the wires that are left from the switch that we just installed, and we're going to feed them through this hole. Because if you look at it, that hole has access to the side. So we're going to feed them through where the other wires go, and then out that side. I've used white wires in both places because it simply does not matter which wire goes where. What you're doing is you're connecting the two wires together to ground the magneto. It's a very, very simple ignition system. When the magneto is grounded, or the two wires are connected, the engine stops running. When the magneto is not grounded, or the two wires disconnected, the engine is allowed to run. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take and strip just a little bit of the insulation off the end of these two wires and slide the crimp connectors that are on the wires from the switch included in my kit on there and crimp them in place. I've got this panel sitting partially tucked inside the generator so that it won't put any additional stress on that choke cable, because like I stated earlier, that choke cable is an ordeal to reinstall. So I'm going to take and strip just a little bit of wire or insulation off of each of these wires. Okay. Hopefully you can see just a little bit of insulation is just stripped back from each wire. And as I stated just a few seconds ago, it does not matter which wire goes where. That's why I made both the wires in my kit white, so that it would not build anxieties in people who are assembling it and worried about which wire goes where. It simply does not matter. So once you crimp it, test pull and make sure it's tight. And just be very careful not to overstress that choke cable. Okay, so now we've got these wires hooked into place. We can go ahead and tuck them right in here next to this large white connector right here with the two blue wires going into it. So we'll go ahead and tuck these wires right up there. The excess wire we're going to put in this area because we don't want it to run into conflict with that choke cable. Okay, real quickly here. these two connectors that you crimped, if the generator will not shut off when you flip the switch to the opposite position, it means it's not grounding the magneto. And check and make sure you got a good crimp on those connectors. If this switch winds up allowing the generator to run when the switch is down and shutting off when the switch is up, you can either leave it that way to confuse your friends who really have no business playing with your generator anyway, or you can loosen up on the nut and rotate the switch 180 degrees. Personally, I prefer up to be the on position and down to be the off position. Now if we come over here, you'll see that there's another hose right here that is connected to the fuel selector valve. Now where it goes on to the fuel selector valve, you'll notice that there's a 90-degree turn. And this hose is a formed hose. This end of the hose is 3/16 inch. The other end of the hose is 1/4 inch diameter. And that would be the end that connects to the carburetor. So we're going to go, and you'll see that there's a 90-degree turn, and in up approximately 3 inches from the 90-degree turn, we're going to cut this hose because we're going to use this portion of it that is 3/16 and has that formed end on it. So I'm going to reach in here and I'm going to cut it approximately 3 inches away from the fuel selector valve. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the other side of the generator by the carburetor, and you will see right here is this hose is the same one, and I'll go ahead and touch it with my flashlight. This hose is the one that we just cut, and you'll see that it goes into the carburetor and it's held on with a Corbin clamp as well. So we're going to go ahead and remove that hose and loosen up the Corbin clamp, same way we did the hose that was on the fuel selector valve. And we're going to slide this hose off of the carburetor. There we go. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and slide this hose out of the generator, because one end of it was connected to the carburetor. We've disconnected that, and the other end that was connected to the fuel selector valve we have cut off. So this section of hose will slide right out. A couple of things I'd like to show you. Number one, this is the hose that we just removed that went from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. And you'll notice how this end is slightly larger, and in here it is smaller. And that's where it goes from 3/16 to 1/4 inch. I just thought I'd point that out. So next, you're going to take this section of 1/4 inch hose that's included in the kit, and it's a little over 6 feet long. If you look right here, you'll see this hose with the braided sleeve around it that runs along under the carburetor. You're going to feed this hose right under this braided hose and all the way through to the other side of the generator so that it can poke out the other side. Okay. I don't know if you can clearly see this or not, but this is the hose that we ran through. We've got it under the braided line, and if you can see back in there, viewed from this direction, it goes just to the left of the choke cable. The same choke cable that I was mentioning earlier is so precious that we have to be careful not to knock it loose. Okay, so now what we'll do is head over to the other side of the generator and connect this hose to the original 3/16 hose that goes into the fuel selector valve. Now, back over at the side where the fuel selector valve was, we will take the hose that we just fed through from the other side, and we will take the adapter that's included in the kit. You'll notice that this adapter is a 1/4 inch on one end, 3/16 on the other. We'll take the 1/4 inch end and we will feed it or slide it into the 1/4 inch hose. Like so. And then we'll take the 3/16 end and we will feed it into the stock 3/16 hose that's still connected to the fuel selector valve. My kits come with two different sizes of clamps. There's going to be the smaller clamp, and that'll be used on all the 3/16 hoses, and then the larger size clamp, and that'll be used on all the 1/4 inch hoses. And let me show you how these clamps work real quickly. You'll put it around the hose and you'll squeeze in. If it's a little bit crooked, you just squeeze side to side and that straightens it out. If you need to open the clamp, just like that. So first thing I'm going to do is put one of the smaller clamps on the 3/16 hose and squeeze it down. And then I'm going to put the larger hose on the 1/4 inch and squeeze it down. I kind of messed that up. I got it in the wrong place, so I'll go ahead and remove it and move it over about 1/8 of an inch. Okay. So now, as you see, we've got our 1/4 inch hose connected to the factory 3/16 hose. So what I'm going to do now is get my forceps up and out of the top here, and I'm going to take the original hose that we removed from the front of the fuel selector valve and put it back on. I'm going to take one last peek at the choke cable, which is right here, and it is actually perfectly aligned. I got lucky on this one. So let me go ahead and put this hose back in place, and of course it's the one that we took off earlier in this section. And then we'll go ahead and put this panel back in so that we don't accidentally knock that choke cable out of place, because that would cause us to use words we can spell. I think you know the ones. Okay. So here is our hose. We're going to slide it. Go ahead and spin that carbon clamp around to where it'll be easier. Slide that hose onto the fuel selector valve. And then we'll slide that carbon clamp up And the choke is still right where it belongs. Just want to make sure that these wires are not going to hit anything. Okay. So once you get everything safely in place, you'll undo the forceps, swing this panel out, and just let it ease the recoil start back into place. Okay. Once you have verified that you don't see any kinks in the hose from the other side, pull this out just ever so slightly and take a peek in there and make sure that your recoil start rope is not going near the fuel lines. Because when you pull on the recoil start rope, if it's rubbing against a fuel line, it will cut it very quickly. You don't want to pull too far out on this, just enough so that you can see that once again, the fuel hose is not kinked or bent, and the recoil start rope is not rubbing against the fuel hose. And then we will go ahead and put the 4 screws that originally held that cover back in place. And that cover will be on, and then we don't have to worry about the choke cable. These are the 4 countersunk screws that we removed earlier. We'll go ahead and put our fuel selector valve back on too. Now with the fuel selector valve, you'll notice that there are 3 sharp corners and 1 rounded corner. And if you look in here at the fuel selector knob or the stem, you'll see the same thing. So make sure that you line the rounded corner up on each of these, otherwise that knob will never go in and you'll be fighting it. Then go ahead and put the screw that you removed earlier back in place. Make sure it moves freely, and then go ahead and put your rubber plug that you removed earlier back in place. And now this cover is done. Okay, so now that we've got this panel put back on, we're going to go ahead and put the front display panel back up into place, which should give us a sense of accomplishment that the thing is actually going back together now. Just shove all the wires in behind this panel. Make sure that you're not pinching any of them. We've only added 2 wires, so that's not a big issue there. And with this switch mounted slightly below the center line of the Eco Mode wording, the panel can be pushed into place. So we'll go ahead and put the screws back in. Okay, so this is your new on-off switch, and I like it so that up is on and down is off. If, when you test it out, if it turns out that up is off and down is on, then you can either leave it that way or loosen up this nut pull the panel back out and rotate the switch to where it's right side up, and then put it back in. But that's your new ignition switch. Now while this is all assembled, this is the off position for the fuel. This is fuel on, and this is choke. So obviously you'd turn it all the way to the choke position when you first went to start the generator. So what we want to do is now, and I've turned it back to the off position, is we want to come over here and make sure that this choke is working correctly. So there's the choke linkage. This is the off position. That's the run position. That's the choke position. That's back to the run position. And that's the off position. So the choke cable is correctly installed and it moves freely. Okay, so now if you come around the back of the generator, we're going to go ahead and pull the back cover off. And it's held on with 4 number 3 Phillips head screws. So you go ahead and pull these screws out. And take a moment to notice the fit and finish of this cover. It's not real good. And that's just the way it is. And I would encourage you that once you get this cover off, to go ahead and do a refit, because that'll give you a lot of confidence later on. In other words, when you take this cover off, go ahead and reposition it right back on, and you'll see that it takes some finessing to get the cover on. And rather than think that you damaged something and that's why it's so difficult, if you put it back on immediately, you'll see that it just doesn't fit real super well. What you do is you take it, and this area right here slides up into this groove. So I slide it in so that the bottom goes over that, then push the top in, then slide the top up so that this gets into place, then tuck the 2 side tabs in, and then start with one of the bottom 2 screws, and then add the top 2 screws when I go to assemble this again. But at any rate, we're going to remove this cover for now. Okay, now that we've got this hose in place and connected to the 3/16 hose, we want to run it back just below this braided hose all the way to the back of the generator. And I'm going to cut it even with this spar. We can shorten it later to get the exact length. And then we're going to take this hose and we're going to cut off a 16-inch section of it. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take the 16-inch piece of 1/4-inch fuel line that we just cut, and we're going to feed it behind this air hose that has the braided nylon sleeve. Then right here where the carburetor is, we're going to run it underneath the float bowl, behind the intake runner, curve it around and hook it onto the fuel inlet port of the carburetor, right where this hose used to be. And remember, this is the hose that we cut on the other side. That was 3/16 inch, and it came down about 3 inches and then had an elbow on it, and we cut that off. This is the 1/4-inch end, and you can see where it's necked down to the 3/16. So at any rate, this is going to feed behind this hose, underneath the float bowl, behind the intake runner, and then it's going to turn into a curve back and plug on to the fuel inlet on the carburetor. And I'll show you all this once I get it done. Okay. So here's the hose, runs behind this air line, and you can just see where it goes underneath the float bowl. And that's it curving around right there and going onto the carburetor. Now, because this area is so restricted, you've got two methods that you could use for clamping it. One is the hose clamps that are completely reusable, and the other one is the zip ties that are not reusable. However, you're not going to be servicing this, so because it's a whole lot easier, and I do mean a whole lot easier, to put the zip tie on it, basically what we're going to do is fold the zip tie around and tuck it through, then push it up into place and pull on it with a pair of pliers to tighten it. I'm going to remove the breather hose. It'll make it a little easier, and we have to remove the breather hose later on anyway. So set the breather hose off to the side. You will be reusing it. And that just gives us a little bit more room to get in here and put a zip tie on this tie wrap or on this hose. So I've got it looped on now, and I'm going to reach in there with a pair of needle nose pliers and pull it up tight. I'm going to leave that tail of the zip tie on there just long enough for you to see all this. There it is. You can see where the zip tie goes onto the hose, and I'm going to go ahead and cut that tail of that zip tie off. And now, if you look up in there, you can see that the tail of the zip tie has been removed. What you'll do now is just make sure that this hose that runs back here has a nice smooth radius bend, that it's not kinked anywhere. Then what we're going to do is take the fuel pump that's included in the kit, and that would be this guy. So go ahead and find a pair of scissors to cut the bag open. Okay. This is the fuel pump. It'll have a little gold screen on it, and that's a vent line. If you spin it around like this, this is the way it's going to be mounted. This is fuel in to the fuel pump. This is fuel out of the fuel pump, and this is the pulse line. There are caps over the fuel in line and the fuel out line. Since this hose back here is the one that goes to the carburetor, you know that that's fuel coming out of the fuel pump. So one more time, we're going to make sure that that hose is a nice smooth bend with no kinks in it. We're going to come back here, and this hose goes onto this port of the fuel pump. And that would be this hose right here. This hose. However, the fuel pump is going to be sitting on the bottom of the generator down here. So this hose is going to be leaned down just slightly. Like this. If you look at it with the fuel pump installed like this, the two ports pointing up and the fuel outlet port pointing forward, you'll notice that we need to cut this hose. And if you look at it from this side right here, you'll see on the stator housing, right at the edge of the plastic, where the blower housing goes on, I'm going to cut it to where it goes about a ½ inch past that screw head. And this is the hose that we just got through installing with 16 inches. We're going to trim it just a little bit shorter. On my particular generator, I'm going to cut 1 inch off of it. And I do advise you to go ahead and cut it at 16 inches still. That way when you get it all together, you can look at it and decide for yourself whether it's just a little bit too sharp a bend or if the 16 inches worked out perfectly. So I'm going to pull this hose out so that I can push it on to the fuel pump. So now you've got two ports facing up, and the one port, that lighting is not very good, is it? Okay, I'm going to pull the hose out here so I can get at it better, and I'm going to push that hose onto the fuel output port. While I've got it out here, I'm going to go ahead and put a hose clamp on it because it's easier to do it now. And I'm going to put the clasp of the hose clamp facing away, and I'll show you what I mean as soon as I get it in place. So here's the view of the fuel pump that you had before, and you notice the clasp is toward the engine. And then we're going to tuck it back in here again. So here's the fuel pump right here. And you can see where the clasp is on the fuel pump. And the fuel pump's just going to sit right down in here in this little recessed area. Now remember, you don't want it to get in the way when you're putting the cover on. And that's why I've got it tucked right down in here. Next step is going to be to remove the valve cover. The valve cover is held on by 4 bolts with an 8mm head on each bolt. The valve cover just lifts right off. Let me go over a couple of things real quickly here. The kit is going to come with a replacement valve cover gasket. And if you'll notice, it is a Yamaha valve cover gasket. That's because this particular engine is a copy of a Yamaha engine. And I could get replacement parts from Yamaha very easily, where with Cummins, it's just a little bit tricky to get the replacement parts. At any rate, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the stock PCV valve, because we will be putting our own PCV valve in later. So if you look, you'll see there are 3 Phillips head screws that hold that breather plate in place. So let's go ahead and remove those 3 screws, take the breather plate out. With the breather plate out, you'll notice that there's a reed valve right here. And what we want to do is open that reed valve up to where it stays open. The easiest way to do that is with a pair of needle nose pliers. We're going to poke through from the back so we can hold the reed valve open with our thumb. And then we're going to go ahead and bend that reed valve with a pair of pliers so that it stays open. Okay, so now you see that I dropped it. So now you see that the reed valve is always open. And what that does is allows us to get access to crankcase pressure and vacuum, which is going to oscillate the diaphragm on the fuel pump back and forth. Otherwise, it would have just been pressure, then nothing, then pressure, then nothing. And this way it'll be pressure, vacuum, pressure, vacuum. And we're going to put a replacement PCV valve just down from the fuel pump driver's port. And what this does is it allows us to get access to crankcase pressure and vacuum without having to drill another hole in the engine block. So then we'll put the 3 screws back in. And snug them down. Okay. This valve cover gasket is in new condition because this is a brand new generator. However, if you're working on an older generator or you tear the gasket for some reason, you'd use the replacement gasket that's sent with the kit. This one obviously doesn't need it, so we'll be able to save that valve cover gasket for later on when we wind up having to do a valve adjustment. And I'd have to look at the spec sheets on this engine to see how often Onan recommends valve adjustments. So now we go ahead and we put our valve cover back on the engine. Couple things worth noting. There's a nice little recessed area right here that this emissions sticker fits right on. Unfortunately, somebody got in a hurry when they assembled this engine and they stuck it here on the valve cover. So if you happen to have one of those, I recommend putting it back in this nice little recessed area that looks like it was intended for that to go. So now that we have the stock PCV valve disabled, we're going to go ahead and install our own PCV valve. And this is the PCV valve. This is 1/4 inch hose, and this is a 5/16 hose barb. So it will be difficult to force it on. However, it will go. And then you'll put a clamp on it or a zip tie, whichever one you prefer. Okay, as you can see, it went right on. So if we put a zip tie, the clasp portion will face up. And as you can see, here and here, I use tie wraps or zip ties because of the fact that it is so tight in that area, and you're not going to need to service it. This area right here, if you take the valve cover off to do a valve adjustment, you will have to disassemble it. Now we've got the original stock hose that used to go from here and up over to here. What we're going to do is we're going to remove this 90-degree section, and you'll cut about 1 1/8 off of either, so it goes 1 1/8 this way, around the corner, and down 1 1/8. So we'll go ahead and trim this to fit. So here, and this goes back on to the original port. Now keep in mind, until it gets to the PCV valve, and incidentally, don't be the guy that emails me saying that that's PVC, as in polyvinyl chloride. This is PCV, as in positive crankcase ventilation. I actually had a guy email me trying to correct me and so on that. Don't be that guy. Any leaks up to the PCV valve would be very important, because if it leaked, it would dampen the amount of pulse wave. After the PCV valve, it's just a vent, and you could actually leave this hanging open. It would not pass emissions that way, but it is not going to hurt the performance. So I'm going to put another hose clamp right here before the PCV valve, and I'm going to point it up so that it doesn't hit the cover too badly. Okay. And as I said earlier, this and this, it's just a vent. Okay. So now, if you look at our fuel pump, you had the 2 ports coming out of the top. And remember, as you're looking at it from this direction, this port here is the pulse port. And that's the driver circuit for the fuel pump. And that is the location where there's going to be another hose, and it'll go from the T-fitting on our new PCV valve up out of the way so it doesn't block your access to the spark plug, and curve down to the pump. And this hose we're going to cut to 21.5 inches, and if we have to trim it later, we'll do so. But if we trim it at 21.5 inches to start with, it should be pretty close. I'm just going to feed this back and plug this right onto this T-fitting. Okay. So now you can see where it goes on the top of the T-fitting. And I'm going to go ahead and put a hose clamp there too. I'm going to face that hose clamp backward for the same reason that I did these out of the way, is I want as much clearance between that cover as possible. And this is one location where, truth be known, you could put a zip tie instead of a hose clamp, because you're not going to be servicing this. Truth be known, you might be able to get away without a clamp at all, but I sent enough clamps with the kit. And now what I'm going to do is take a zip tie and wrap it around this silver bushing back here and the hose, just to keep it from wandering around. So now you can see that hose, or that zip tie, and it went around this little spacer right here, and is held in place fairly snug now. What we'll do is we'll take our breather hose and we're going to route it, make sure it doesn't hit anything. It's going to go in front of this recessed area where there's a nut that holds the back cover on. So just make sure that it doesn't block that. And it's curving around, and it's going to go to the fuel pump. Now remember, the fuel pump is going to be pushed down just a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll route our hose, make sure that there's plenty of smooth bends on the hose, nothing too sharp, and then trim the hose appropriately if we decide it's just a little bit too long. And I'm going to say that I cut that hose about 1.5 inches too long. But again, I would rather it be just a little too long and I can trim it short than to have it too short and wish I hadn't done that. Okay. We'll take another hose clamp, put it around this hose. And I'm going to turn it so that the clasp portion faces the front of the generator. The only reason that is because this back cover is just a little bit of a pain to get on. So we don't want the clasp portion of our hose clamps interfering. And now we will take another section of this hose, and this one we're going to cut 2 inches long. And this would be the 1/4 inch hose that was included in the kit, so we're going to cut a 2 inch section of it. In this 2 inch section is going to go onto the 3rd port of the fuel pump, which, as you remember, is fuel in. The first thing I'm going to do is there's a T-fitting. So one arm of the T-fitting is going to go into this 2 inch hose, and then the other end of the 2 inch hose is going to go onto the fuel pump. And it does take quite a bit of pressure to push these hoses into place. Okay. Now, this is the hose that tied into the 3/16 hose that was on the fuel selector valve. And this is going to run just outside this air hose with the nylon sleeve behind this panel, and it's going to go on to this tab of the T-fitting. Okay. I'm going to lift this out of the way just so you can see better. If during the course of this install, if this clear hose has gotten knocked out of place, it goes into, there's a little black, I'll call it a trough, underneath this gray area. There you go. And that is a float bowl drain. So you'd loosen up this screw on the float bowl if you need to drain the float bowl. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put zip ties right along here. I don't want to crimp this hose shut. It's not being used at all now, but if you do need to drain the float bowl, you need that hose to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect the fuel inlet hose and the fuel outlet hose and that air line and zip tie them all together right here. And it does not need to be super tight. Just enough to hold it. So it doesn't get in the way when you go to close the cover. You'll get plenty of zip ties with the kit, so if you wanted to put another zip tie up here around the fuel inlet hose and that air line with the nylon sleeve, you can. I just don't go tightening it too tight because you don't want this clear plastic hose to get crushed between the air line and the fuel inlet hose. That's just going to hold it in place. So now we have one more hose, and what we're going to do is we're going to hook a piece of hose onto this and run it up and over and through a fuel filter and then back down, and one piece at a time. There's my cutter. So we're going to cut a piece of this 1/4" hose, 11 inches long this time. You'll notice that there are arrows on the fuel filter, and the arrows point in the direction of fuel flow. And since this is the input line from the remote tank, it's going to flow this way. So we're going to hook this hose to this, and then this will go to the T-fitting. Okay. We want to check all our hoses and make sure that nothing's kinked or pinched or being wedged or obstructed or whatever. Okay. Now there's going to be one more hose, and it'll go from here and it'll curve around in a gentle loop, and that's going to be our fuel input line from the remote tank. We're going to cut this one 19 inches long. It's already 20 inches long. That's close enough. We'll trim it to fit later. So now we'll push it on to this fuel filter here. If you look, you will see that right here by the choke, there's an area just big enough to fit a fuel hose. And we're about to take advantage of that. Just barely big enough, but it is big enough. So we're going to run this hose behind the breather tube, then behind this hose right in front of the choke assembly. Now what this does is it puts the fuel filter up here to where if you unsnap this cover, you can look at the fuel filter and see if it needs to be serviced or changed. This hose is just going to lay right through here for now, and when you need to use it, you will slide this little door out of the way and route this hose out through here. This little trap door, you can either lay it inside the generator housing or attach a string to it like I did earlier. Keeps you from losing it. But for this, we're just going to set it inside here. But when you're using it, and we'll finish it up in a few minutes, it's going to have a quick disconnect port. Right now I want to take a few minutes and put hose clamps everywhere there is not a hose clamp right now. So we're going to have a hose clamp before and after the fuel filter. And then Then we will put hose clamps on the fuel pump and at all three lines from the fuel T. I'm going to spin the clasp where it faces the front of the generator to give us just a little bit more room when putting this rear cover on. And if you find it to be just a little bit too tight, as in tight a fit, you can use the zip ties in this location also, because they are a smaller profile. They give you just a little bit more room. So now what we want to do is look and make sure that the hoses are not kinked at all. Remember, this hose right here is carrying air and this one is carrying fuel. Okay. I think I like it with the air line to the right of the fuel line. So the fuel line, being the one with the T-fitting, is to the left. Okay. So now we'll go ahead and put the rear cover back on. And as you remember earlier, it's a little bit strange. So we're going to put the bottom in, then put the top in, and slide it up, and tuck the sides in place, and then start putting screws in it. Okay, we're definitely hitting the home stretch. Now, come back over to this side and we hook up our fuel inlet port. In the kit, you'll get two of these quick disconnect fittings. One goes on your fuel tank, the other goes right here. What you'll do is take the roll of Teflon tape and wrap some Teflon tape around the threads and wrap it in the direction that the threads screw onto. Be very careful. Do not overlap the end. By that I mean do not do like this, because when you screw the hose barb on, it'll shear off a little piece of Teflon tape when you do that. Now, truth be known, it will get caught in the filter, so it won't do any harm. But we would like to not clog up the filter with unnecessary things. So then you will screw this on. Let me get a couple of wrenches to tighten it down. Okay. And this is going to go right into here. Okay. This is just going to curve around and be tucked into here. When you are running off the stock tank, it'll be tucked into this area. When you want to run it off the remote tank, you will undo this cover this little piece would be in here, and it would be tucked in here like this. So you would undo this cover, pull this out, route the hose out through where this cover was at, and you'll notice that I put a piece of string on it. Just tuck that cover in behind there, put this cover back on, and that way you don't have to drill any holes in the casing to put the fuel quick disconnect or fuel inlet port. If you want the inlet port mounted, that's also possible. This is a customer's generator, and he did not give consent to drilling a hole in the case of his generator. However, if you choose to mount this quick disconnect fitting solidly, you can move this rubber pad out of the way, drill a hole through the top of the generator housing, because there's plenty of room to put the hose barb in here. What you'll do is, instead of just bolting these two together like this, you will sandwich the housing right through here. I urge you, if you do that, to mount it so that the barbs are facing forward, so that when you snap the fuel hose on it, the fuel hose is running over the front of the generator instead of running along the back right in front of a hot exhaust, because you don't want hot exhaust blowing on your fuel hose. So what we'll do is one last hose clamp. We'll tuck this in, put that little cover plate in place. So now this is all in place. We'll put the cover on it. And there you go. When you're running the generator, you open up this cover, slide this out of the way, put the fuel inlet port hanging out, and hook onto it. Unless, as I stated earlier, if you wanted to mount it solidly, which, like I say, this particular customer did not give consent to have a hole drilled in the casing of his generator, and that's perfectly understandable. The last step in the install is to put the sticker on the generator and its basic operating instructions. If you want to run it off the stock tank, you run it as though nothing had been changed. If you want to run it off the remote tank, then you make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the off position and run it the same way. So with the fuel selector valve in the on position, pulls fuel from the stock tank. Fuel selector valve in the off position, pulls fuel from the remote tank. I'm going to go ahead and leave this for the customer to put at a location of his choice. And who knows, he may choose not to install it at all. Otherwise, there's room here. I don't really want to cover any of the maintenance information on it, but it could go here. Once again, if you have any questions about the kit, please contact me through my website. Do not attempt to contact me through YouTube if you happen to be watching this video on YouTube. If you look in the description section below, you'll see that there is a link to my website, and contact me through email or phone on the website, and I'll answer any questions you have. If you want to just leave a comment, then feel free to leave a comment, but don't put any questions, something that you would require a response quickly from. I thank you for your time.